Though much has been said about why people enjoy horror, why people enjoy being scared, less has perhaps been said about why people enjoy the disturbing. What I mean by this is not merely the gross, the uncanny, or the off-putting. Cartoons such as Ren and Stimpy or Courage the Cowardly Dog, the work of Jack Stober, Felix Colgrave, or Quentin Dupieux, these are all disturbing in a more surrealist sense. They are disturbing in the sense that they are unnerving, throwing the viewer off-center. They are enjoyed for their humor, their often spectacular creativity, and the feeling of unease they conjure in the viewer. And unease, I think, is healthy for anyone to indulge in from time to time.
I'm exhausted, Dolph. I think I'm at the end of the world.
Oh. Do you like it?
I don't know yet. I gotta be honest, it's a bit unsettling, all this void. But it's also kind of pleasant.
Arguably less healthy is to indulge in the stark suffering of humankind. To indulge in media which skirts the line of moral and ethical decency. It is perhaps harsh to claim that anyone would enjoy such content, but it is the implication. After all, why else would anyone sit down and watch movies depicting nothing but the most gruesome violence and morbid misery, if not for enjoyment? There is a kind of moral judgment in that implication, that anyone who seeks out these films may be doing so against their better judgment or because of unseemly desires. But I think the films that make up the vague genre of disturbing movies are not all that different from most media we consume. Where they diverge is in their reluctance to be consumed. There is no shortage of disturbing films out there, although I'd wager a great many of them fall closer to camp or schlock than anything truly soul-besmirching. However, it's not unusual for even the schlockiest of gore productions to be at best boring and distasteful, and at worst unethical in their production. Exploitation cinema provides us with an excess of movies about exaggerated violence mixed with pornographic imagery, indulging in a wide range of bigotry and human suffering.
People, we are free, we are there, and we are beautiful.
Some of these movies have gained notoriety as especially disturbing, like the Cannibal films or the August Underground trilogy. But even the most depraved of disturbing films remain works of art. They are expressed through the same artistic trappings as blockbuster films and Oscar-padded sensations. How explicitly a film depicts violence doesn't actually mean much on its own. Films full of explicit violence and hideous acts and imagery can be incredibly funny. Or they can be philosophical, political, and even beautiful. The film we will talk about today, however, displays some of the worst this strange genre has to offer, and I figure we may as well start at the bottom. I held off on seeing a Serbian film for a long time, but it felt like it was always there, this ominous thing on the horizon. The most disturbing film ever made. I had to watch it. How bad could it be? The film follows Milos, a retired porn star, as he is hired to star in a pornographic art film without knowing what he is expected to actually do in it. The director of this art film and the man who hires him is Vukmir, a man prone to the dangerous combination of monologuing whilst being the author's stand-in. This is the kind of film and the kind of story where dark turns lead to darker ones until the film finally goes off the deep end and never comes back. It is especially in this lattermost part where a Serbian film appears to be doing its darndest to perpetually one-up itself in visceral, sensationalist misery. Among disturbing films, there are those that desperately want you to think they are disturbing, and a Serbian film is very much one of them. From its grimy score to its shaky cam and dreary color corrections, it is a film that wants you to know that you are having a dark and shocking experience. In content, however, what you're actually in for is a parade of sexual abuse and awkward pornography. One of the stranger aspects of this film is that although nearly every death and harm in the film is committed through sexual abuse, and the film spends much of its time showing acts of sexual abuse, a Serbian film is not actually about sexual abuse. Likewise, although most of that sexual abuse is directed against women, the film is not about misogyny either. Misogyny is a matter of course in a Serbian film, but women are also depicted as the only people with any potential sense of humanity and morality. I'd argue that what is interesting about this movie is not that it hates women, but that it vehemently despises men. I can only hope that anyone watching this film who identifies with masculinity is deeply insulted by what it claims masculinity to be, and the biological essentialism it attaches to it. Because the driving force behind the atrocities performed in the film is a pointedly gendered male libido. And that is not a hot take, not a personal interpretation, but the explicit plot of the film. What drives the main character of Milos to commit his most horrible acts is a drug that does nothing more than dramatically increase his libido. According to this film, that is all a man needs in order to rape a person whilst chopping their head off, among many other horrible things. But this potent drug, described as a cattle aphrodisiac, is shown to not even be necessary for committing horrors even worse than those committed by Milos. Men throughout the film commit all manner of atrocities under the influence of nothing at all. The problem, the film screams at the viewer in nearly every scene, is the male sex drive. Now, was this the movie's intention? Did director and co-writer Sergeant Spasjevic set out to make a scathing hit piece on masculinity? I very much doubt it. The principal reading of the film, the one most popularly bandied about, is derived from Surgeon's authorial intent as mirrored in the film's title. According to Surgeon, the film is about Serbia and modern human societies in general. It is about the pornographic nature of our societies and about how Serbia sucks.
Absolutely. I like to consider the whole film as a giant metaphor of different horrible things that are happening to us.
Interviews with Surgeon extensively detail his authorial intent, which is far-reaching, varied, and largely unsupported by the film itself. If Milos could be called the protagonist, then the antagonist is clearly that of Vukmir, the director of the film Milos is starring in.
Vukmir. To stvarno zvuči kao jedan od ovih naših iz Haga.
Vukmir is perpetually monologuing, and the film gives him a great amount of time and space to do so. Surgeon has claimed that Vukmir is actually an exaggerated representation of the new European film order, but the peculiar thing about Vukmir is that he makes similar points to Surgeon, and talks about the film he is making in very similar ways to how Surgeon does.
Roditelji odbace, znaš li kako je to? Kad te roditelji odbace. Moraš ceo život svetu da dokazuješ kako umeš da se staraš sam o sebi. Kako umeš da sereš, jedeš, jebeš se, piješ, krvariš, privređuješ, radiš sve! Sve što traže od tebe da bi opstao pre nego što umreš.
This whole tangent goes on for quite some time, and it makes the same point that Surgeon has made about the film, if in more words. According to Surgeon, a Serbian film is about how we are screwed from birth, screwed our whole life, and then screwed even after we're dead. Although it goes without saying that he didn't use the word screwed. This is about as deep as this metaphor gets, rendering it akin to making a film about how we all live in a society. This is not to say that metaphor or symbolism is a bad thing, and neither is a lack of clarity. There are plenty of films that do confront horrible and difficult subject matter with sincerity and artistic ambition, incorporating metaphor and symbolism in ways both blunt and subtle. Likewise, I think there is much to be said for films that attempt to coax certain emotions over having any particular clarity of literal meaning. What feeling a Serbian film creates in its viewer is highly subjective, but I'd be surprised if anyone takes much more away from this film than an aimless sense of revulsion. Though infamous for its transgressive violence, many of the scenes of violence in the film can be downright tedious to watch, full of shaky cam and frantic cuts. I expect this was done to convey a chaotic energy in the scene, but its actual effect is one of compensating, where the camera, the editing, and some grungy color correction is trying to make up for the lack of anything interesting going on. There are so many of these wobbly scenes in which, had the camera been still, I expect they would either be far more horrifying or they would look bafflingly silly. Despite its transgressive violence, and in many ways because of it, a Serbian film is cowardly, unable or unwilling to confront the difficult subject matter it exploits for shock value. It conjures up scenes of violence and misery, but avoids placing them in any clear context. The scenes of violence are themselves often presented in these blank, warehouse-looking rooms, or in actual voids. In other words, the violence is presented as existing for the sake of it, shocking for the sake of shocking, devoid of any grounding in actual human reality. Not only does a Serbian film not confront misogyny, sexual violence, or human trafficking as some claim, but a Serbian film isn't even really about Serbian society. Its focus lies in the actions of a scant few individuals placed within no greater context than the film itself. From beginning to end, a Serbian film is angsty. It has something to say about how we all live in a society, but it doesn't know exactly what it is saying, or how, or why. In an oft-quoted statement, Sergeant once concisely summed up the meaning of the film as being a diary of our own molestation by the Serbian government. It's about the monolithic power of leaders who hypnotize you to do things you don't want to do. You have to feel the violence to know what it's about. With this in mind, the film perhaps says more about Sergeant than it does society. Leaders do not hypnotize anyone to do anything, just like an increased libido doesn't make anyone commit rape and murder.
On i njegovi zamjenici, komandiri, Neđo Bošković i Damjanović Vesa, oni su nam rekli da moramo ići svim u zatvor, svim. Tamo ima žena da siliju radi borbenog morala, za podzadnje borbenog morala, podnožje. I Miro Vuković je rekao da možemo da je vodimo Đoča. I ako hoćemo da je ubijemo, jer nema dovoljno hrane u zatvoru, a stižu nove zatvorenice i nema mjesta za spavanje. I mi smo sjeli u auto, sretku auto, Golf, i odvukli prema Žući. Tamo je Sretko Damjanović izašao, a Mića je ostao prije toga u restoranu sam. Izašao i ubio jednim metkom iz pištolja u čelu.
Serbian leaders did not hypnotize their population to commit systemic rape and ethnic cleansing during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, which led to the independence of the Serbian nation at the expense of the Yugoslavian Republic and its non-Serbian peoples. Sergeant's authorial intent is taken seriously by many interpretations of this film, but I think it is given far too much weight. Interpretations of the film often place Sergeant's intent alongside a greater historical context, including not just the history of Serbia, but the history of Serbian cinema. Attempting, in this manner, to retroactively justify Sergeant's scattershot authority. But by following that same historical context, the film's contents paint a different picture, intended or not. What a Serbian film is in this context is a film about justifying violent acts as beyond one's control. A film about the perpetrator of atrocities being the real victim. Personally, I would prefer it if I could contrive the film to secretly be a text promoting the deep end of man-hating. I wish I could draw on Valerie Solanas and concoct some convincing theory about the film as an exposé of the animalistic depravity of the male sex as it is implicitly rendered in a heteronormative ontology. I say I wish, because then I don't doubt I'd find it much easier to talk about this movie. At my most generous, I think this film could be read as a kind of metafiction. The art film director in the film can be seen as an author's stand-in, Sergeant lampooning the creation of his own film as pretentious wank made solely for its shock value. But the truth is that a Serbian film is trash, and not fun trash, not particularly interesting trash, just trash. This is not to say the film is not disturbing. There were a few scenes that made me sick to my stomach. The most famous of these, of course, is the rape of a newborn baby, which just looks like a rubber baby being pushed towards a crotch. It's gross, definitely, but that infamous scene, like so many others in the film, come across like the film trying so very hard to be dark and edgy. And in the end, that's all a Serbian film is. It is a try-hard edgelord movie. Much of this video so far has been me trying to read into the film and the intent of its main author, or the lack thereof. And I admit that much of it is just me grasping for something to give meaning to the experience. And the lack of meaning isn't the meaning of this film either. Is a Serbian film the most disturbing film ever made? It is not by a long shot. A Serbian film is nothing new. In Shock Schlock it is fairly basic. It's just another piece of aggressively nihilistic misanthropy ready-made to be thrown on the pile of tacky gore flicks, next to the Saw franchise and the filmography of Eli Roth. When we are deeply disturbed by a film's depiction of violence, perhaps the horror is not that it is explicit. The horror is not that grotesque images are now trapped in our minds for the rest of our lives. The actual horror is that being disturbed by a film's depiction of violence is not the norm. The violence we are used to, the violence we accept and find entertainment in on perhaps a daily basis, is depicted without the ugliness of actual violence. Even those of us who have never committed an act of violence nor ever wished to will regularly and nonchalantly seek out and indulge ourselves in depictions of violence stripped of their tangible consequence and psychological toll. Violence is strange in that we ardently consume it, but do not want to be confronted with it, a fact which extends to the world in general. But portraying the ugly reality of violence is, I think, not a simple thing to do, as even explicit portrayals of violence are often sterilized into sensationalism. A Serbian film is extreme. Its depictions of violence are explicit and largely convincing in their realism, but not quite. And the story and world of a Serbian film is not convincing at all. The depiction of violence, it turns out, is a lot more complicated than degrees of explicit portrayal. More often than not, an unclear portrayal can be more disturbing than a blatant one, and a lack of violence can be more harrowing than explicit portrayals of it. How violence is expressed, framed, and contextualized affects our perception of it, and there is no real honesty or truth inherent to portraying violent acts. This may seem obvious, but I think it is easy to forget. In our perpetual consumption of violence, how often do we stop and consider how that violence is framed and what that framing means, what it does to us? I mentioned near the beginning of this video that disturbing films are not all that different from most other media we consume, and so I leave you with the following consideration. The character of Milos, what he does and why, is rote. Milos does what people do in films everywhere. He commits heinous acts of violence against his fellow humans, excuses it as beyond his control, defies the villain of the story in an explosive act of catharsis, and then, heroically, kills his wife, his child, and himself to spare them from suffering. Milos does horrible things, defeats the villain, and makes the hard decisions. Milos is just another bland male protagonist.